Hello, everybody. Hello, welcome. Welcome to our Changemaker Forum. We have our special guest today, Dr. Amishi Jha. And if you are just joining us, hello, Amishi. Nice to see you.
Great to be here.
Yeah, really excited for today. And we're just having the participants join. They're filtering in. And while we do that, if you're on the Zoom call as a participant, go ahead and just text us where you're joining us from. We typically have a global audience, so it's always so much fun to see where everybody is joining from. So if you just go to your chat bar and let us know where you're joining from. So we have Beijing, welcome. Chris, Wichita, Kansas, Amsterdam, Virginia, the Czech Republic, New Mexico, Minnesota, Lisbon, California, Venice Beach, Alberta, Canada, London, Bogota, Michigan, Canada, wonderful, the UK, Texas. Love seeing the participants and where you're all joining from. And we usually give a couple of minutes in the beginning for people to join. Toronto in Vietnam, welcome. Nuremberg, Germany, welcome, welcome. So if you're just joining, text us where, or rather chat us in the chat bar where you're joining from. Always so much fun to see our global audience. So welcome, everybody. My name is Rich Fernandez. I'm the CEO of the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. We teach neuroscience-based mindfulness and emotional intelligence skills around the world to communities and organizations and individuals. I am so thrilled today to be able to welcome our special guest, my friend and colleague, Dr. Amishi Jha, who is also a board member here at the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. And we're going to get into it in a second, but I just wanted to give a brief introduction. If you're not familiar with Amishi Jha's work, I think you should be. She is literally one of the world's most renowned neuroscientists, especially in this field of attention studies and contemplative practices. But Amishi, if you could just bear with me a second, let me give the formal intro. You're a professor of psychology at the University of Miami, and you run the Contemplative Neuroscience and Mindfulness Research Initiative, Practice Initiative. You have worked across the world with the World Economic Forum, the US Department of Defense. You've worked with elite athletes. You really focus a lot on attention and the effects of mindfulness-based training on attention, on cognition, emotion, resilience. Amazing TED Talks you've given, amazing presentations at the World Economic Forum, huge grants, research grants to study the effects of attention, especially in high stress situations with elite performers, again, whether it be in athletes, military, and so forth. You've consulted with the Pentagon and so many other organizations. So I think importantly, and for today, we're really going to focus on the release of your book, which I think happened was it last week? Peak Mind? Yeah.
October 19th.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just get into it then. And for those that are listening, we'll certainly make some time at the end for 15, 20 minutes of Q&A that you could just chat through. And of course, this will be recorded and you could watch it afterwards, and I'll have it up on our website at Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute as well. So Amishi, Peak Mind, tell us, first of all, why did you write this book?
Great question. Well, first of all, it's just great to be here. You know, as you mentioned, I am a board member, and I just love this organization. I love everything you're doing, and everything that you said regarding my own background hopefully makes sense why I'm so excited to be part of this organization. So I just wanted to start there, and also thank everybody that's coming. It's so great to see really our global, Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute's kind of global reach. So I'm very happy to be here with you, Rich, and with everybody attending. And yeah, the motivation for this book was really an opportunity for me to take what we'd been learning in the lab over about the last 15 years or so as it relates to not only the brain science of attention, but the costs of certain kinds of normal life circumstances for all of us, but particularly more intense for certain populations, on attention, the degradation that occurs with attention, and then solutions that we'd come to that we found repeatedly were beneficial. I just felt that we were at a moment where we didn't need to leave this for the lab, for only a select few who were on our research studies, but it could be offered in a way that was accessible and hopefully beneficial to a lot more individuals. So that's part of what motivated me.
Absolutely. And, it is really accessible and I think compelling actually, because it is based on research. It is based on the study of attention and the ways that you can cultivate attention. I love one of the things you describe in the book is attention is you say it's powerful, it's vulnerable, and it's trainable.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about what that means exactly? How is it?
Yeah, maybe we'll break it down for all three because I think all three are very important and kind of related to one another. So the fact that attention is powerful, what I mean by that, just from a brain functioning point of view, if it kind of requires us to go back in time to think about why we even have an attention system. We take it for granted. We all know we have this, but why did it develop? And it developed really as a solution to a big problem that the brain had as creatures were evolving, our long, long ago ancestors, of not being able to fully process everything in the environment. So you have to kind of subsample what's going on. And part of that meant a capacity of the brain to narrow what was going to be its focus and then privilege information processing from whatever was its focus so that the entirety of the brain could be used for the purpose of taking in that information. And that's a pretty powerful thing. That means that whatever we pay attention to, it does transform the way our brain operates. So even in this moment, as I'm looking at your lovely face, my friend, everything else that is not, related to what's on the screen in front of me is sort of darkened out. And that means that all of the brain is recalibrated for this purpose. So that's the powerful piece, which means that we've got to be very aware of where we put our attention, because the consequences could be, if we put it in the wrong place at the wrong time, it could be consequential.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But it ends up that, and especially because of this power, because of its consequential nature, when things don't go right with our attention, and we all know what this feeling is, like, I lapsed, I goofed, somehow I made a mistake. At the little things like maybe you left your coffee cup on top of your car, or maybe you can't remember where you parked your car, to really bigger things that a lot of the kind of professionals that we work with face, where an attentional lapse can mean the difference between life or death. Whether it's a surgeon that may have lapsed away, um, or a service member who made an error or wasn't responsive in the way that was required. Those are really big deals. And so what I became curious about with this second topic of powerful, we talked about vulnerable, is what are the circumstances under which attention tends to be compromised?
Yes.
So what is it that makes it lapse more often or get thrown off, hijacked, if you will?
Mhm.
And we were triangulating around kind of three themes over and over again that I thought were very interesting. So those are stress, meaning experiencing this sense of overwhelm that the capacity we have is not up to the task of what's required. Threat, which could be both kind of physical threats, somebody actually endangering you, somebody or something, and even psychosocial threat. The idea that people are looking at me in a particular way that either means that they think I'm not quite good enough, or maybe I'm so good that I feel the pressure of that as well. So stress, threat, and then poor mood. And really what I mean by that is negative mood, having sort of a dysphoria about it. And the kind of tricky part about this is not only do these factors degrade our attention, but that when our attention is degraded, we're more likely to experience those things. So
Ah,
it becomes this sort of weird catch 22, which leads me to the third point, which was, if it's so important and so vulnerable, and we're going to loop ourselves into these terrible situations where we're going to drive down our capacity further, maybe there's a way we can train people to actually protect against that. Because I wish we could say, let's just remove those factors in our lives. Let's just not be stressed or threatened or have poor mood. It's not the case. And for some of the groups that we work with, it actually describes in kind of pristine detail the professional environment in which they need to operate at their best. So the
mhm.
trainable piece, which is where mindfulness comes in, was really regarding a search to figure out what was enduring, what could we find in the lab over and over again could protect attention. Because a lot of things did temporarily, but then they wore off and they weren't really enduring for people.
Yeah, and what I love about your work and your research in particular is that it keys on different attentional systems in the brain
Right.
and talks about how then best to train those systems. So just for the sake of like everyone who's listening, Can we talk about that? I think you talk about in your book at least three of those
Yes.
attentional systems: the orienting, the alerting, the central executive function, and how all of those are trainable. So maybe if you could give us a little bit of a sense of what each of those are and why they're
Yeah.
important and how we can train those.
Right, right. So, we've been talking about attention and we've used that term sort of as in a monolithic way, like, oh, our attention, and we kind of get what that means. Typically, what we probably mean is focus. But that's ends up only being one way we pay attention. And you described all three of them, right? Orienting, alerting, executive control. And each of these are sort of foundational aspects of attention. And I want to just go back to what I said a moment ago regarding why we have attention and the need for the brain to be able to solve sort of an information processing overload problem. Like, there's too much out there. I can't possibly deal with all of it. So you've got to advantage or privilege information processing in some way. And that's what attention does. So when we talk about focus or the orienting system, what we're doing is we're advantaging certain content over other content. So right now, like I was saying a moment ago, your face is the most important content, and your voice and what we say to each other. Everything else, what's happening in the room next to me, or the air conditioning, or whatever it is. I live in Miami, so it's hot. Um, Not as relevant. And in fact, the fact that I'm focusing on you actively inhibits me being able to pick up other stuff. So, content based focusing is something we probably all know quite well. And the metaphor I like to use, and I think we've also talked about it in our prior time together, is sort of like a flashlight, or, for our colleagues and participants who are from other parts of the country or world, the torch. So wherever, just like in a darkened room, wherever it is that we direct that, we're going to get privileged access to that information. And just like I was saying a moment ago, anything that's not within that focus is going to be dull, dimmed down, not as prevalent to me. What I love about that kind of metaphor is it really gives us that sense of agency. We can hold that flashlight, we can direct it, we can decide where it goes. But the other thing to keep in mind, in addition, and by the way, we can hold it not only to direct it to the external environment, but internally as well, which is, I think, such a fundamental, and I think probably a skill we take for granted. So even following your ability right now, Rich, and everyone listening, to comprehend my words as they are unfolding out of my mouth, right? You're actually actively paying attention and building sort of this narrative internally to be able to understand it. If instead you were kind of all over the place, the flashlight was buzzing around, you wouldn't understand what I'm saying. We wouldn't even be able to comprehend. Now, that's not just other people's words, but our own thoughts that we can focus in on.
So keying on basically high signal to noise ratio, like high signal, like your voice, your thought stream, your language, and the way you're putting it together is a signal that I'm keying on. And I'm kind of dampening any other noise with my focus or my orienting attentional system.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that so the key features of this are it can be directed willfully, wherever we want it. It can be directed toward the external environment and the internal environments, thoughts, feelings, sensations, emotions. But the other thing to keep in mind, which relates to kind of our modern crisis of attention, if you will, is that flashlight can get pulled and yanked around. And it gets yanked around by very kind of specific things that are, again, tied to our evolutionary history. What would we think could pull our attention away from whatever we're doing? I mean, if you think long ago to our ancestors, anything threatening, alarming, self-related, bright, shiny objects, etc., will pull attention away. So, even if you're in a darkened room and you're pointing the flashlight to a particular part, maybe you're trying to find the door to get out, if you hear something behind you, you're going to flip the flashlight back. And that gives you a sense of what the kind of temperamental nature of this system. So, and we know in our daily lives, like we have every intention to write this difficult email or finish this difficult report, but the notifications on your phone go off and boop, your attention's over there. Or an alert on your computer, whatever it is, it's so prone to being not just willfully directed, but pulled.
Right.
So that's the orienting system. In some sense, if we want to talk about the second two, it might help us just kind of maneuver through. The second system, as you mentioned the term alerting, is really about almost the exact opposite of being narrow, focused, high signal to noise ratio. It's this broad, receptive stance we take. And what this system is privileging, because it's also privileging information, but it's not what it is, like the flashlight, it's when. And alerting is privileging now, time, this moment, because you need to know what's happening in this moment. And so if you're driving down the road and you see like a, some kind of construction site or some strange traffic pattern, there might be some kind of flashing lights that alert you to say, pay attention here. The feeling that you get when you're in that mode is very different than laser focus. It's broad receptive. I don't know what's going to happen now. I better be aware of everything going on right now, not something that happened last time I was here or that might happen in the future, right now, so that I can be receptive and take action as I need to. So I think
A
that
low
when
signal
I
to noise ratio, the opposite. Low
very low
signal to
signal to
noise,
noise.
right? But
Exactly.
more
'Cause
receptive, like you said, open, the awareness kind of muscles,
it
the wrong
is.
word, the
Yeah.
awareness kind of set of neural
Capacity.
networks.
Yeah.
Right, right. Dorsolateral.
Absolutely. And we can take this to the kind of next level, which is not just awareness of what's happening in the moment, something like situational awareness, to the external environment, to the internal environment, but also a term we use in the mindfulness community, meta awareness. So
Mhm.
awareness of our awareness, the processes and content that is arising in our phenomenology, kind of moment by moment.
Yes.
It's also tied into that notion of this low signal to noise ratio because you're not privileging anything over anything else. You're just trying to observe and be aware. In particular, from our evolutionary survival advantage perspective, take action as needed.
So being aware of the experience we're having as we're having it, like in real time.
Yeah, I would say alerting as the kind of primary attentional system was just to be aware of our surroundings.
Oh, so environmentally too.
Right, our
Right, right.
surroundings, our external environment, but that same capacity we can cultivate to use it for the purposes of being aware of our phenomenology, our sights, feelings,
Right.
memories, thoughts, all of it.
Okay.
This full situational awareness, if you will.
Awesome. Well, then,
Um,
so that's two. And just for if you're listening, what we're doing is we're just talking about at least three of the key attentional systems in the brain. And in a minute, once we talk about the third one, which is the executive function network,
yeah,
once we've sort of defined these terms, we'll talk about how to actually develop them, right? The capacity of each of these attentional systems. But first, we're just kind of clicking through, the three
yeah. And
main
part of
ones.
the reason is not just to give everybody a neuroscience lecture on attention, though I love doing that too, but it really is so that we have shared vocabulary and so that the kind of assumptions we might have of what our attention is can be broadened to include it more wholly. Because
Mhm.
oftentimes I think when I say attention, people think of one way. As soon as I start saying, but what about when you're driving and you're alert? Well, we understand that as well. And this third system people will get a sense of as well, as you mentioned, called executive control. And executive functioning is just like that term executive that we use in the business context. The executive's job is to ensure that current goals of the organization and current actions of the organization are aligned. And in order to do that, you need to know what the goals are and hold them. So, something called working memory to just hold the goals. But you also need to be able to inhibit. So, don't engage in actions that are not goal relevant, right? Override those. You need to be able to update. So, if the environment changes, if information comes in that says that goal is not appropriate anymore, update it. And then also shift. It's like right now, my intention is to listen and talk to you, but all of a sudden, if the fire alarm goes off in my house, my priorities will change and I'm gonna have to take action to shift my goal. So these are also sort of all part of this family of functions called executive functions. Oftentimes I'll refer to this kind of system as a juggler because we're doing all these different sub kind of processes, but the goal is to keep all the balls in the air. The multiplicity of our demands requires us to use executive control. And it's probably the most sort of um, I would say tied to things like fluid intelligence, performance success, dynamic behavior, so we can do stuff in complex environments. I just traveled for the first time after 19 months, something like that at home, like many of us probably. And I'm like, oh, I haven't been exercising all these complex things I got to do, like even just getting myself to the airport on time and getting myself on the plane. Like,
Mhm, mhm.
and that you feel it like, oh yeah, I'm not used to managing and prioritizing in that way. And when we do that again, we realize these are things that can all be trained, and probably training ourselves could help us because of this issue of vulnerability that we talked about a moment ago.
Oh, I love this. Okay, so now let's get into the training piece of it. But just to recap, and I'm going to use your language because I know
Yeah,
this is from your book.
yeah,
The focus system you call like the flashlight or the torch, the
yeah.
narrow beam, hyper focused. Then the orienting system, to use your language, I think is the spotlight, right? The kind of like
Well,
broad.
sorry, the alerting, the next system. Yeah,
The alerting.
orienting is the first one. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
right. Yes. Sorry. The alerting system is like a spotlight, broad awareness. And then the executive function is the juggler, kind of keeping everything all kind of moving and dynamic so that you can have goal directed behavior and, do things
Yeah,
over
yeah.
time. So then in your research, this is what's hugely fascinating to me about your book and your whole body of work really over the years, is that there are ways to train those different systems. And you've keyed on what are the ways to do that with specific populations, right? Especially, I think, high stress, right? With like some mood as well issues, right? And then thinking about how to make those practical and accessible. In other words, like, are you talking about long interventions or things that people can do on a daily basis and the
Right.
minimum amounts they need to do to have benefits? And so can you just tell us a little bit about that
Sure,
research
sure.
around?
And I think that just to say that's my orientation. A lot of times when we're in this mindfulness space, and especially as somebody who has spent a long time interested in mindfulness, I think it's very important to say I didn't come to study mindfulness, frankly, because of an interest in mindfulness. I mean, I've come to love this topic and these practices, but I came to it really as an attention researcher, somebody who, just to back up for a second, we just talked about all these systems of attention. We talked about its power and its vulnerability. But to make it very clear, I think of attention really as a fuel, as a top type of fuel. And what it fuels, because it uses all three of these different subsystems, is our capacity to think, as we talked about, just even following a train of thought, to feel emotion. And that one is probably surprising for people. Like, what? I need my attention to feel emotion? Yes, we do. And we need it to regulate our emotion so that our responses are proportionate, right? So feeling a little bummed out if you knock a cup of coffee over is fine. Breaking out into hysterics, not really commensurate with the thing that happened. So regulating ourselves. And then thinking, feeling, and then the third one is connecting. The ability to communicate with other people requires, the flashlight is directed, the floodlight or spotlight is broad and receptive. The juggler's always keeping in mind, what's the goal here? What's the shared goal? So this is what I mean by fuel. And if the fuel gets spent out and really your petrol, if you will, your gas tank is getting emptied because of life circumstances that promote stress, threat, poor mood, it's going to be a bad situation. And for the kinds of groups that I work with, I was saying this before, it's not just that, like all of us, there's ups and downs of life where these conditions come up. It's that the circumstances in which we ask for them to perform at their best are typified, are defined by high degrees of stress, a lot of
Mhm.
potential threat, and poor mood will come. Poor mood
Mhm.
will come. So that's sort of the landscape. Is attention's a powerful, and I wanted to work with populations that we're gonna probably have problems with them, but we don't want lapses to occur. We don't
Like
want to surge.
service members out in the
We don't want
field,
to surge into
or
labs,
theater,
right?
or a surgeon. Yeah.
Yeah, surgeon, first responder,
Mhm.
military service member, even
Mhm.
student. We don't. I mean, I'm a professor. I don't want my students' attention to lapse. I want them to understand my words, understand the concepts, and succeed. So anyway, the first thing was that when people undergo kind of high demand, high stress intervals, including something like the academic semester or a busy sales season, or if you're a lawyer working up for a big trial. So these
If
aren't
you lead
even like
anything, a leader of anything,
a
really.
leader, a leader, well, you know this.
I know
You
it
know this
well.
as a leader and who interfaces with a lot of leaders. It's not even, let's say, game day. It's not the most consequential moment, but the lead up to the important event can also be high stress and high demand. So what we did is we brought people into the lab, and sometimes we'd bring the lab to them if we were doing it out in military bases, and we evaluated. So all these systems that I just described, we have a whole toolkit of cognitive psychological tasks we can give them to evaluate it. So we'd evaluate their functioning and then come back several weeks later, evaluate again. And what we saw repeatedly, regardless of the specific group, is if they were undergoing high stress intervals, their attention significantly declined. It got worse. And this is before it was time to be on the trial or have that big game or actually take your
Mhm.
final exams. And so the solutions that we came to, and this is where mindfulness entered the scene, was offering mindfulness training during those intervals. Now, as you can imagine, the kind of groups that we're working with, they don't have a lot of time. And especially if you want to interface with them during high stress periods, they're like, I really don't have time. And I remember, the very first grants I received from the Department of Defense to work with military service members. This was back in the not even, it was before 2010. So there was like a repeated deployment cycle, a lot of things happening. People were very, very intensively occupied with what was happening at that point. Iraq and Afghanistan was both on our radar, and I got $2 million in grant funding, and I could not find a single leader, military leader, who would take the project. It was
Mm.
like I had the grant, I'd made my case to the funders, but the actual application of it, nobody wanted. And the main complaint was, you're asking for too much time. You want what, 24 hours over 8 weeks, and we're in pre deployment? No way.
Which is the traditional and sort of best studied mindfulness intervention does take, and I think that's MBS, mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is
Exactly.
about 24 hours in total duration over the course of, is it 8 weeks,
Yeah.
requiring roughly 45 minutes of practice 5 to 6 days a week, right? So that for active duty military or anybody who is like with a lot of demands on their time and attention, probably not the most practical and accessible way. And so I
Right.
know in your research, one of the questions was then how do we format it? And
Exactly.
I think just to clarify for folks, I think, was it mindfulness-based attention training, your solution set? Is that?
So that's what we started with, what we thought was the gold standard. Like you said, mindfulness based stress reduction, those are the parameters. But then after finding that I couldn't get my foot in the door, we actually went on another series of studies where I'm like, okay, we got to get a minimum effective dose. Because
Yes.
if the gold standard that we know works, that there's an evidence base behind that shows, and we'd found it even in my own lab, that attention can be benefited, mood can be lifted, stress reduction is possible. It had all the solutions we wanted, but nobody's willing to implement it. It's useless, right? It's like somebody saying, if you want to be in a better physical shape, you can train for a marathon. It's like, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
Sorry, that's
But
not
just
going
to
to.
be clear, it is the gold. It is the gold standard. So I don't want anyone to get the impression that mindfulness-based stress reduction is not of huge value. It's just that
No,
in populations,
it is
yeah,
a lifeline. And
yeah.
what I'm about to say regarding the solution that we came up with is that in many ways, it had to be the model for anything we did next, because we knew it worked, and it works over and over again.
Right.
But unfortunately, because of the time pressured nature, people weren't willing to engage in it. So the thing that we ended up doing is figuring out, okay, what are the key components? And I was very grateful that people like John Kabat-Zinn and Sharon Salzberg, eminent teachers, I had to put them in the position where, like, okay, if I only have 8 hours, what should actually be in here? And so we did systematically, with their support and their help, try to figure
Mhm.
out kind of least amount of time and best practices to include, to go from 24 to 16 and 8 hours, to
Yes.
reduce the amount of time. And at the same time, I was trying to reduce the amount of daily time that people actually would invest, because 45 minutes a day, though beneficial, was not something people would give. So yes, more recently, what we've done is we've figured out through a series of studies that about 4 weeks of training formally and about 2 hours a week with 12 to 15 minutes of practice daily can really stave off this attentional degradation that a lot of different groups experience. And
Mhm.
and actually, to answer your question that you asked me at the outset, why I wanted to write this book, it's that these practices are not unique. I didn't come up with a lot of new. We didn't come up with. It was me and my dear colleague Scott Rogers that developed mindfulness-based attention training, and
Mhm.
partly we like that name because MBAT sounded tough, sounded serious.
And that.
But the practices themselves are part of the traditions, and they're part of every mindfulness based intervention out there. The difference was we contextualized it for the particular context, and we trained trainers to deliver it. So we had, teachers delivering it to teachers, military spouses delivering it to other military spouses,
Beautiful.
performance coaches for soldiers delivering it to them.
That's beautiful. And so you found, I think, is, as you said, sort of minimum effective dose, and we should reiterate minimum effective dose. And for, high stress groups, looking specifically at helping them develop attention, mood and betterments and stress management, 12 minutes a day, 4 to 5 days a week as a minimum effective dose
Right.
that has been testable and shown to impact
Yeah.
those
And I
things.
think it was really important to show that there is some kind of threshold. People that practiced less than that, but came to the course, sat there, but did not get to that 12-minute mark, did not really benefit.
Did not benefit. Right.
But this other part is very important, and it relates to what you said regarding MBSR being the gold standard. If you got to 12 and you practice more, you benefit more, which
Yeah.
is the beautiful part. It's like you don't have to. And a lot of soldiers would ask us that. They're like, okay, ma'am, I got to steady state, but how do I actually optimize? And the answer is just like physical activity, do more to benefit more.
Yes.
So repeatedly, we were able to find that. And just to say what was in the 12 minutes, it was essentially things like mindfulness of breathing, open monitoring practices, loving kindness practices, body scans, walking meditation. There's going to be many different things that we do that actually engage and exercise these brain systems. But the key was that we introduced them in a way that really motivated what utility people in these high stress, high demand groups saw for them.
Hmm.
And then gave them a range of practice time that was doable. It's like, oh, 12 minutes, I can probably work that in.
Yeah.
And then they did.
It's fascinating to think that less than that didn't really seem to have an effect, but more could also, and the minimum to have an effect,
Yeah.
a beneficiary effect, 12 minutes, and then more could enhance the effect as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think of it a lot like physical fitness. So if somebody said to you, "Do you think going for a walk with my dog every day is really good for my physical health?" I'd be like, "It's probably fine. It's not going to hurt you. It's probably good to be out in nature to get a little walk in or wherever you end up walking your dog. Could be busy streets of a city, but it's not fundamentally going to transform probably your physiology. You have to do something. Maybe it's couch to 5K. And in some sense, MBAD and the practices that I offer are that kind of couch to 5K for your attention. It's getting in that mode that it's enough of a challenge and enough of an engagement that you're starting to really have an impact.
Hmm.
And then the more you do, the more you benefit. In the same way you can go on to train for a half marathon or a marathon if you choose to.
So incredibly fascinating. And I think more than fascinating, extremely valuable for the field, because this is sort of a research-based methodology that, has been replicated and shown to have these effects. So now I want to talk about the application,
Yeah.
right? Because you've talked about using these tools and practices to develop our capacity for focus, for awareness, for executive function. You've entrained and researched these with certain populations that are in, like you said, high demand, high stress environments. What other applications are you seeing out there for this body of work for people, let's say everyday people in organizations, students? What other applications? Like, why is this? I really feel like it's very important. Why do you think this is important for,
Well,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think that the first thing is that the current moment that we're in, most of us I feel like I just stopped somebody walking past my house and I said, "Hey, how great do you think your attention is?" Most people have this view that like my attention is terrible. I can't focus on anything. I feel like I'm in a fog all the time. Like we have this growing sort of cultural moment of
Mhm.
our attention is not our own. And partly I want to convey that our attention hasn't changed all that much. Our attention is just fine, frankly. But there are really factors that are present right now and more prevalent right now than have been there before that are taxing us in ways that are probably emptying the gas tank more readily, and practices that we're engaging in as a culture that are driving us down further. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that all of us are in some sense high stress, high demand. And if we're not in this moment, we will be at some point in our lives. And frankly, we don't know when that will be, right?
Mhm.
We don't know when the difficulty will arise. So part of the reason to want to bring this broadly, not just to certain professions, but to all of us, is just like physical exercise. The better shape we're in, not only the better we'll feel, but the better health we'll have to live our lives. Same idea with attention. If attention we know is vulnerable, why not train it to help ourselves? So
Mhm.
it's a combination of things, but it is this particular moment really makes us feel, I think, for many of us, like attention's not my own. And one of the particular cultural norms that I think is quite problematic is this notion of multitasking.
Yes, talk about that because it's a myth, I believe, right? Is that the
Absolutely.
case?
It's
Yes.
absolutely, it's a myth. I mean, it's a myth just in terms of the term. So notice that in all of the things that we said, I didn't say, oh, all of your flashlights and all of your jugglers and all of your floodlights. We got one. We got one. And our focus is singular. In fact, you can contrive situations when it looks like maybe you got a couple flashlights, but really, for the most part, we have one. And because remember, we're recalibrating the brain to advantage more information processing but about something, whether it's content or time or goals or whatever. So you don't want to have that fractured in some way. And so what multitasking we think we're doing is taking multiple attentionally demanding tasks and doing them simultaneously, but we're not. What we're actually doing when we put ourselves in a multitasking context is task switching.
Hmm.
So essentially, we're taking the flashlight and we're shining it one place, and then we're moving it to another place, and then we're moving it back. And I like to think about. I just think this is kind of a handy way to think about it. If you put yourself in a multitasking context, if you think of your brain as like a studio apartment, and let's say this moment you want to use your studio apartment to cook food, meal prep for the week. So you got, it's a small space. You got to basically your entire apartment is now your kitchen. I got, you know, items to chop up here, and then I got my stuff I'm going to put it in, etc. And now all of a sudden I'm cooking, I'm fine. And then I'm like, oh shoot, I've got visitors coming. We want to make it seem like it's appropriate for socially hanging out. So I got to put all the stuff away, move my couch out, put the way, the appliances that I'm cooking with. And now I can have a social moment with my friends in the studio apartment. But now I got to cook back again and set everything up. So that feeling of exhaustion of reconfiguring this limited space for multiple purposes is essentially what we're doing with our brain when we have it do two different tasks. It's having to reconfigure the entirety of what it does, which is exhausting. It
It's
is actually
inefficient, it's
exhausting.
error prone, right? When we do that task switching, which I love you said that we're not actually multitasking, we're actually task switching. And
Yes.
that process is highly inefficient, exhausting, and error prone.
Exactly. I mean, you're going to leave out the chopped vegetables when you're trying to have a social social time. Things are going to happen like that. But I think that the reason to say this is that um, oftentimes we think that this is a better way to be efficient. Leaving my notifications on for email while I'm trying to write something, it just makes me more available. I need to be available. Okay, fine. You may need to be available. And I'm not arguing with anybody. I've certainly been in a position where I don't feel like I can turn off my phone notifications. My child may be texting me to pick, her up or something like that. But I'm much more aware that there may be times when I don't need to do that. I don't need to put myself in a position where I'll be forced to multitask or task switch. And when I have those moments, I should take them. I should really aim for monotasking.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
But
great.
that's part of our thing. I think our need to change the cultural norms to understand that we are driving down our own capacity to pay attention. We're spending out cognitive fuel unnecessarily.
Yeah, and a lot of the things like technology can sometimes be deliberately designed to kind of pull our attention away from the thing we may be doing and to hold our attention. And
Oh, not sometimes. I mean, you're in the
Mhm.
Bay Area. You
Almost
know this
always, yes.
conversation.
No, I mean, it's
It is the
persuasive
commodity.
technology, right? Like
Right. It is the
really
commodity that
horrible.
is
Yeah.
right. When we think we're having our chill time on Instagram or TikTok or whatever your particular thing is, it's basically mining your attention. It's
Yes.
it's it's spending it out, which that's a
Algorithmically.
whole bigger conversation regarding our choices to do that or not do that.
Right. And I also really appreciate that you name it as a cultural moment, right? Because like rather than, feeling guilty or bad personally, like this is a thing we're all swimming in, right? Where for whatever reason, our culture and the way we've created the tools that we use in the contemporary context are oriented around like distractibility and like, mining the vulnerability of our attention in
Exactly. It
a lot of
pulls
these.
that flashlight toward it over and over
Yeah.
again.
And the
And
good news is, and that I want to reiterate, and again, your research squarely points to this, is that we have a capacity, always have the capacity to cultivate anew our attention, our awareness, to kind of reboot, recharge in some ways,
I
right? That's
mean,
like,
if attention is the fuel, we can refuel ourselves. That's the really cool part. We can actually take a little bit of time every day and strengthen this muscle and allow ourselves a better ability to make choices, be more
mhm.
aware of what's going on, and use each of these systems more wisely and in the service of what we'd like to not only achieve, but the kind of quality of life we want to have.
Beautiful. And that's the application piece. But listen, I'm aware, I want to make sure we have space for, and we can certainly continue if there's no questions or comments. And I would encourage anyone who's listening to open up the chat feature. And this is deliberately task switching.
On purpose. Yeah.
On purpose, for a goal-directed thing of really having a dialogue with our participants who also may have some reflections or questions you want to share. So I would encourage anyone, please feel free to go ahead and chat in a comment, a question, a reflection that you might have. So this is an interesting question. Thank you for this one. Like when we talk about strengthening the cognitive muscle, right? Maybe I'd put that in quotes. What are we actually strengthening? So yeah, what are we working on when we're
Yeah.
strengthening those?
So let's just go back to let's pick a specific practice that is part of this suite of practices. And I know, that in Search Inside Yourself, we also offer these. So, um, mindfulness of breathing, which I actually call the find your flashlight practice in the book. And I do that on purpose because of a lot of the kind of challenge that I see people running into when they try to do this practice. One of the kind of downsides of mindfulness being so prevalent right now is that people can have a lot of misunderstandings about it. They've heard the term, but not quite really aligned with the intention behind it. So if we think of mindfulness as paying attention to our present moment experience without elaborating or editorializing or reacting to what's happening, if we think of mindfulness as really about getting the raw data of the moment, then we see what we're trying to cultivate. So in something like a breath awareness practice or mindfulness of breathing, or as I call it, find your flashlight, the intention is to have more present centered attention. And so, like, let's just go through, I'll do it pretty quickly. So what you do is you focus on breath related sensations. You select one that's prominent. And in the way that I guide it, and many people guide it this way, you're kind of making that the target of your attention. So it could be the coolness of air moving in and out of your nostrils, or maybe your back or chest moving up and down. You're going to be honing in, and the laser focus of that orienting system is going to be directed there willfully. But the next part of the instruction, the first instruction is just focus on breath related sensations. The next part of the instruction is, and when you notice your mind has wandered away from that attentional target, gently return it back. And so, in that second part of noticing, it's not saying if you happen to be one of those weird people whose mind wanders, because it shouldn't be wandering, it should be laser focused. It's not saying that. It's saying there's a normative amount of mind wandering all of us experience. And our job is to notice it. So we're focusing and we're noticing. We're now engaging that floodlight system, that alerting system, to kind of check in with what's happening right now. And then the executive control kind of comes in and says, you're not on your goal, get back. So with this practice, we are engaging the orienting system, this alerting system, and executive control. And that's frankly what the behavioral studies show and what the brain imaging studies show, is that the networks that are tied to these kinds of functions are not only strengthened in terms of sort of, neural density, but their functional handoff to each other is much more fluid.
So
So I hope
we're
that
actually in
answers
training. Yeah, right. Got it. Yeah.
what that answers the question, that even something as simple as the find your flashlight, and I call it that because that's kind of what we're doing. We're focusing it, but we're watching where it is. That practice allows you to engage all three systems, and repeatedly practicing it strengthens them individually and strengthens their coordination.
So there we are actually training our neural networks,
Yeah.
right? That both in terms of their function and in having them function in these specific ways, like you said, the orienting, the alerting, the executive
Yeah.
control, we're also strengthening their function. So strengthening both function and structure of neural networks.
Which are completely related. The little neurons that fire together, wire together.
Exactly.
In the same way, if we do a physical push-up, we'll get better upper body strength. If we do this kind of mental push-up of
Mhm.
focus, notice, redirect over and over again, those brain systems will become strengthened and their functioning will be better.
So great. And then a couple of questions related to practice. Are there some of the questions here on chat, are there other practices besides breath anchoring or breath related practices? We know the
Yeah.
answer to this question, but it'll be good to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. The only reason we suggest breath, and probably all of us, including, when you're guiding, Rich, is it's a handy anchor. It's always with us. And if our intention, and going back to the definition of mindfulness, is take an observational stance to what's occurring right now, the breath is always occurring. We don't
Mhm.
need to control it. But I would say don't worry about that anchor. If that's not your chosen anchor, choose something else. It could be an image, it could be a phrase, it could be physical sensations of walking. The point is to have a target for your attention. And really, the point, from my point of view, is to develop this generalizable capacity to use focusing, noticing, redirecting in everything else we do in our lives. It's not just about what happens when we're formally practicing. It's so that when we're in the middle of a conversation and we've lost in our own minds and mind wandered away, we can notice that and bring the flashlight back to the conversation partner.
Wonderful. And then one other question, somewhat related, is are there the sort of same type of practices, or do you see these benefits when you mix up these various orienting practices and so forth?
So, right. So far, really, we've only talked about this sort of concentrative kind of practice of mindfulness of breathing, or find your flashlight, whatever you want to call it. But the other practices in this suite are tapping into different things. So, for example, something called open monitoring is really regarding that floodlight, that receptivity, developing an ability to watch our minds in this broad, kind of accepting and receptive stance, which I would say is going to require something else. And we don't do this quite as often, right? We're used to focusing, but we don't practice, because we don't have to probably see ourselves as doing it all that often, staying receptive to what's occurring. But as you know, from being on the receiving end of a conversation partner, if the person isn't listening to you, isn't receptive to what you're saying, not going to go very well. So being able to hold what's unfolding moment by moment, without wanting to kind of get your flashlight in there and point it to various places, it's going to do two things. It's going to make you more able to get the data of what's happening right now, and only with better data can you make the best choice of what to do next.
Mhm. Great.
So open monitoring would be a practice that engages that other component. And then in most of the things that we offer, most of the training program, in fact, all of the training programs, including this mindfulness-based attention training and what I describe in the book, in Peak Mind, has a third kind of practice, which we call connection practice, and is formally called loving kindness practice,
Mhm.
which gets into this whole other realm of well wishes and sort of an orientation of a self-supportive and other supportive orientation toward their well-being.
Yeah, and activates things like skills and capacities around empathy, compassion, which
Perspective
are
taking. Yeah.
perspective taking, which
Yeah.
are all also have very strong neural correlates in the brain. These aren't just nice ideas, they're actual parts of our brains
Yeah.
that can come online and be strengthened, our capacity for empathy, our compassion. And okay,
Right. And frankly, the reason we teach that practice last is because it benefits from having better focus and better receptivity.
yes, yes.
So
All right, so we have some other really great questions. What I would also urge people, and I might ask Grace is one of our team members who's monitoring this chat, to also, of course, put a link to your book, because for everyone who's listening, everything we're talking about, all Amishi's research, the suite of tools and practices, they are in her book. It's an awesome book, so I would just really recommend checking it out. Peak Mind, you see it behind her there, and we'll put in a link for you in the chat. So we have a few other questions that I think are really topical. One is, do these practices apply to younger children, for example, in primary school?
yeah, I think that the fundamental answer is yes, they apply. I mean, attention as a system develops very early on. It actually involves the frontal lobes, all three of these subsystems. Frontal lobes are the latest to mature. We don't actually fully develop our frontal lobes till we're in our early 20s. So the key when you're bringing these practices to children is that they're developmentally appropriate. and that we're not forced. It's almost like you don't want to do anything that would force them to use their brains that's not at the level that they're capable of.
Right.
So it could be, there's wonderful examples of this in all kinds of contexts in the educational arena. But I mean, even as my children are much older now, they're teenagers, but when they were younger, it was fun to kind of play around with these things of like, how do you get a child to pay attention in this broad, receptive way that's
Hmm.
fun for him or her? And so we do this practice, just sit around in like a little circle and have a bell that was just, if you even moved it a little bit, it would start ringing. So the practice was, can you pass the bell around the entire circle
Hmm.
without it making a sound? So they're
Yeah.
staying really receptive to their environment to hear a sound, but they're not actively doing anything. They're not trying to control anything. So they're very and there's such a great field of this work being done to bring into the educational context. And we can actually see many studies now that have not only looked at benefits for attentional functioning, executive control improvements, but brain changes in children that suggest a move toward more developmentally appropriate strengthening of these brain systems.
Mm. That's amazing. All right, so a few other then related questions. What about for folks who have attention deficit or other sort of organic
Yeah.
conditions where some of the neural networks are a little bit different for those folks, and so attention, how does that apply? How do these tools apply to folks?
In some sense, the answer is very similar to what I just said regarding any specific population like children. It has to be appropriate for that context and that population. The thing about ADD and ADHD, it's not really a mystery what's going on. All of us in our lives, just like I said, in terms of being under high stress circumstances, our attention declines. We all have different set points for each of these systems. And we also have set points for the coordination between these systems. So oftentimes, the category of attention deficit disorder is sort of a broad thing. Sometimes it could mean hyperfocus, you can't get the flashlight off something, or it
Mhm.
could be lack of focus, the flashlight's all over the place. It could be a floodlight that is overly attuned to any little thing that goes on, so you have hypervigilance. Or you have executive control challenges where you just aren't remembering the goal and all the balls are dropping. So, you can see that it can be each of the systems, it could be the coordination between them. And so the good news is the solutions are very similar. We can train these systems repeatedly over and over again. And studies on adults, for example, with ADD offer practices very similar to the ones that we were describing, but in a more gentle and potentially even more, gentle in terms of the ramp up. You're not going to start with even 12 minutes a day, let alone 45 minutes a day. You want to probably start out with very active practices. So, for example, instead of sitting quietly, especially if there's a hyperactivity element, instead of sitting quietly and having to deal with not moving, have it be active. Have people walk, notice the sensations of walking itself. So they need to be catered for the community, the population for which you are intending to benefit.
I love that. That's so helpful. And okay, well, maybe one other last question here, which is around. We talked about technology as being a source of distraction and distractibility, but what about facilitative technologies?
Yeah.
Are there technologies? There's a couple of comments, questions here around things like the Muse brain sensing headband, which we're familiar with, or HeartMath, that application, which ostensibly are designed to help us train these attentional qualities. Do you have a perspective on those?
I can't speak specifically about either of those, but I think it's an interesting enterprise of why not? Let's see if there are
Mhm.
technologies that we can add to our toolkit that could benefit. The one thing that I think will probably drive what's beneficial ultimately is if we can actually help people through the technology assisted or practice assisted approach be able to gain more meta awareness, which is, again, like we said, awareness of the ongoing contents and processes in our mind. Because unless we do that, if we're relying on some other system to tell us, external to us, where
Mhm.
we are, it's going to be too late. I mean, it's like getting to the bottom of a page and you're like, where have I been? Or you're in the middle of a conversation and somebody calling, like, are you listening to me? It's like, that's too late of a moment. You need to be aware of and monitoring before that occurs.
Mhm.
So that's the thing we want to cultivate. Now, that I think is not a trivial thing to try to get people to be able to do on their own. But if you can harness that capacity to become more familiar with the internal landscape moment by moment, there's going to be more power to change focus, change gears, change goals, whatever you need to do in response to the knowledge of where you are.
Right. Yeah, I like to say, it's not using these tools to get your mindfulness on. Mindfulness, the goal is to have your mindfulness on, right? To be mindful as you move through life, right? And passive and compassionate. And these tools, if they can help that in a sort of separate context, right? But you're not going to like, wait, I need to pay attention now. Let me open my app here and find out how to pay attention. Like, I think bringing it to the real world is the point. Yeah.
Yeah. Fluidity in this dynamic, complex thing we call life. I mean, you've got to be able to have it embodied in the same way. I was just, when I was mentioning I was traveling, like I was putting my suitcase above my, my seat. And I was like, if I decided in this moment, I don't have enough upper body strength, I'm going to get on the ground right now and start doing actual push-ups. That's too late.
It's too
So
late.
we need to embody these. We need to embody that strength, because when we need it, we need it. We can't wait to cultivate it after.
And I just want to address one last comment that showed up here. Is there any benefit to letting our minds wander free? Because I wouldn't want the impression to be that we always need to be like meditating and like being in this, right? Like, what is our natural state?
I love that question, because the answer is yes, we don't do that enough. That's actually a real downside of our modern world. There's so many things that can grab us. We need to actively think about having this kind of white space, the unencumbered opportunity to have spontaneous thought arise, task-free. And one of the reasons mindfulness can be so beneficial, because that is so beneficial, is that sometimes when we let our minds go task-free, we'll default to worrying, catastrophizing. We think we're letting our minds wander free, but we're in certain neighborhoods that tend to get us of the mind. And so mindfulness can actually help us unhook ourselves even in those moments. So practicing mindfulness is a great thing for all the reasons we've been talking about. Letting your mind roam free gives the attentional system a break. And if you've got mindfulness as a toolkit while you're letting your mind roam free, it can protect you from actually unintentionally spending out your attentional fuel with destructive states like rumination and catastrophizing.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I think you just said something really critical there too, which is these aren't like either or states, right? Like you can, like bring both to bear at any given moment.
Absolutely.
This is wonderful. Again, I want to encourage everybody to check out the Peak Mind book. It's great. It's really, really powerful and profound. I think it's making a huge contribution present day to like what it means to be able to harness these tools and practice them in the reality of our like busy, demanding lives. And then I also wanted to invite anyone who's on this call or who's listening to the recording afterwards. We also want to offer you a discount code, because at the Search Inside Yourself Institute, we do teach a lot of these tools as well around mindfulness and emotional intelligence. Here is some of our upcoming programs that you can see. And if you enter in this code, you can get a 10% discount for any of those programs. I think these are all online programs coming up in the near future. So check those out if you're interested, or just stay connected with us through the usual channels there, but don't over-index on them. So you see all the social media channels. You could practice with us on Insight Timer. We have some guided practices there as well, that very much mirror or parallel what Amishi is teaching. However you choose to connect, please stay connected as part of our community. Amishi is on our board and part of our community. And I think, like I said, your book is a really important contribution at this present time and so needed in this moment. And here's the thing, right? I think I would just say your book is eminently practical and empirically based, which is beautiful. So like you can really feel good about practicing what you see in that or read about in that book.
Thank you, Rich. This has been a lot of fun. And I can't emphasize enough that part of my excitement of just being here with you and obviously doing anything I can in support of this wonderful organization is it's offering people direct access to all the concepts and research that we've shown. So it's a very much a collaboration and a kind of symbiotic enterprise of wanting the science to inform practice, which SIY does so well. So this is a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everybody for really, really kind of paying attention and listening for this hour together with us. All right, everybody, thank you. All the best to you all. Thank you so much, Amishi, and we'll see everyone soon.